There's something about the Arizona territory that breeds legends as naturally as it does cacti and rattlesnakes. In the decades following the Civil War, names like Thunder Jack Reynolds, Deadeye Dan McKenzie, and the infamous Martinez brothers echoed through saloons from Tucson to Tombstone. But perhaps no legend was more carefully hidden, more deliberately forgotten than that of Sarah "Swift-Shot" Hawkins, the woman who once made history as the fastest sharpshooter west of the Mississippi. Join me today as we delve into the extraordinary tale of an aging legend who proved that while time may silver your hair and wrinkle your skin, it can't dull the deadly precision of a master's aim. If this story touches your soul, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale will leave you breathless. Now let's step back to Rattlesnake Junction, Arizona territory, autumn of 1885. Most folks passing through Rattlesnake Junction barely noticed the weathered adobe house on the outskirts of town. Even fewer paid attention to its sole occupant, an elderly woman who spent her days tending a small garden of desert flowers and cooking meals for the local church's Sunday gatherings. Sarah Hawkins, now in her 70th year, seemed to most nothing more than another quiet widow living out her twilight years in peaceful solitude. Her hands, though wrinkled and marked with age spots, still moved with surprising grace as she watered her beloved desert roses. Travelers who stopped to ask directions would never guess those same fingers had once pulled triggers with such speed and accuracy that Buffalo Bill himself had offered her a spot in his Wild West show, an offer she'd declined with a quiet smile and a shake of her head. Sheriff Thomas Cooper, who'd held his badge in Rattlesnake Junction for nearly 15 years, was one of the few who remembered. He'd keep an old poster tucked away in his desk drawer, yellowed with age, but still clearly showing a young woman in her prime, rifle balanced precisely against her shoulder, with the bold text proclaiming, "Swift-Shot Sarah, the lady who never misses." Sometimes on quiet afternoons, he'd pull it out and remember the stories his father used to tell. "Mark my words, son," the old lawman had said. "I once saw Sarah Hawkins shoot a playing card in half at 50 paces, then hit both pieces before. They touched the ground, 3 shots faster than a rattler's strike, but that was before the years had painted silver through her dark hair, before arthritis had supposedly stiffened those lightning-quick fingers, before she'd hung up her prized Winchester and settled into a life of baking pies and knitting shawls for new mothers." The first hints of trouble rode into Rattlesnake Junction on a scorching September morning, thunder rolling across the desert, sky promising rain that never seemed to come. 3 riders, dust-covered and hard-eyed, led their horses to the water trough outside Murphy's General Store. Their spokesman, a tall man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck, called himself Jack, the Viper Martinez. His companions, a burly man with a scar across his left cheek and a younger, nervous-looking fellow with quick eyes, didn't bother introducing themselves. Sarah Hawkins was returning from her weekly trip to Murphy's store, a small basket of supplies balanced on her arm, when she encountered them. The old wooden boardwalk creaked under her careful steps as she approached, her grey hair neatly pinned back, her simple dress clean, but faded from many washings. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said softly, trying to step around them where they blocked. The walkway, the Viper's laugh was like stones scraping together. "Well, look here, boys, Grandma's out for her morning walk." His eyes caught the gleam of a small silver brooch at her throat, one of the few remnants of her former life. "That's mighty pretty jewelry for such a simple old lady." Sarah's fingers touched the brooch briefly, a small silver shooting star, a gift from her late husband James. Her blue eyes, still sharp despite the years, noted every detail of the men before her. Gun belts worn low, handles scraped from frequent drawing, the subtle shifts of weight that spoke of men accustomed to violence. "Just heading home, sir," she replied, her voice carrying the quiet dignity of age. "These old bones don't take well to standing around in the heat." The younger man snickered, elbowing his scarred companion. "Hear that, Pete? The old lady's bones are tired. Maybe we should help her carry her basket. For a small fee, of course." In the sheriff's office across the street, Thomas Cooper watched the scene unfold, his hand resting near his gun. But there was something in Sarah's slight smile. A ghost of the legend he remembered that made him hold his position. Sometimes, he reflected, the most dangerous predators are the ones that time has taught to hide their teeth. The air grew thick with tension as storm clouds gathered overhead, and the legend of Swift-Shot Sarah was about to remind these men why some ghosts of the past are best left undisturbed. Inside Murphy's general store, young Billy Murphy watched the confrontation through the dusty window, his hands nervously twisting a cleaning rag. At 16, he'd grown up hearing whispered stories about Sarah Hawkins from his father, tales that seemed too fantastic to be true. How she'd once outshot the famous Alan Quickhand McGraw in a contest that became desert legend. How she'd single-handedly defended a stagecoach against 7 bandits, dropping each one with a single shot before they could even reach for their guns. The thing about Sarah, his father had told him late one night while closing up the store, wasn't just her accuracy, it was her speed. Some said she could fire 5 shots so fast they sounded like one. Called it Swift-Shot Sarah's Symphony. But Billy, like most young folks in Rattlesnake Junction, had dismissed these stories as tall tales, the kind that grew taller with each passing year. Now, watching the 3 rough-looking men surround the elderly woman, Billy felt an unfamiliar tension in the air. Sarah Hawkins stood perfectly still, her basket of supplies held close, but there was something about her stance that seemed oddly familiar to anyone who'd ever watched a gunfighter prepare for trouble. The Viper reached for the silver brooch, his snake tattoo rippling with the movement. "Come now, Grandma. Surely you don't need such fine jewelry at your age. Why don't you let us take it off your hands?" Sarah's voice, when she replied, carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "My late husband gave me that brooch 30 years ago. I'd sooner part with my right hand." Her blue eyes, sharp as desert hawks, tracked every minute movement of the men surrounding her. Inside the sheriff's office, Thomas Cooper had been joined by his young deputy, James Wilson. "Shouldn't we do something?" Wilson asked, fingers drumming nervously on his gun belt. "Those are the Martinez boys out there. They've hit 3 banks in the last month." Cooper's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes never left the scene outside. "Watch and learn, son. There's something about Sarah's stance that reminds me of a story my father told me, about the time she faced down the entire Jackson gang in Tucson." The tension on the boardwalk was building like a thunderhead. Pete, the scarred man, had moved to Sarah's left, while the younger outlaw circled to her right. The Viper stood directly in front, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "Last chance, old woman. The brooch, or things get unfortunate." A strange smile crossed Sarah's face, subtle as a desert sunrise. "You boys remind me of some fellows I knew back in '55. Same kind of manners." Her right hand, which had been resting in the pocket of her dress, moved slightly. "They didn't fare too well, as I recall." The movement caught the Viper's eye. "What you got in that pocket, Grandma?" "A derringer." His laugh was echoed by his companions, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it now. Sarah's smile never wavered. "Just an old woman's memories, son, and a handkerchief." She slowly withdrew her hand, empty save for a delicate piece of embroidered cloth. "Time leaves its mark on all of us. These days, I can barely thread a needle without my glasses." But as she spoke, the wind picked up and the hem of her dress shifted slightly, revealing the glint of something strapped to her ankle. Pete caught the flash of metal, and his eyes widened in recognition. "Boss," he started to say, "I think I know who this is." Before he could finish, a drop of rain finally fell from the gathering storm clouds, landing with a soft pat on the wooden boardwalk. In that same instant, Sarah's entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders straightened, the stoop of age seemingly falling away, and her eyes took on a hardness that stopped the viper's next words in his throat. Thunder rolled across the desert as Sarah Hawkins stood before them. No longer just an old woman with a basket of supplies, but something else entirely. A legend that had been quietly sleeping, about to remind these young wolves why some old cats still keep their claws sharp. In the sheriff's office, Cooper smiled grimly and settled back in his chair. "Pay attention, Wilson," he said softly. "You're about to see why they used to call her Swift Shot." Time seemed to slow on that sun-baked boardwalk as another roll of thunder echoed across the desert. The viper's hand hovered near his gun, his confidence wavering as he studied the elderly woman before him. Something had changed in her bearing, in the way she held herself, that sent warning signals through his trail-hardened instincts. "Boss?" Pete tried again, his voice urgent now. "That's Sarah Hawkins. Swift-shot Sarah. My pa told me stories." "Shut up!" the viper snapped, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "That swift-shot woman's just a legend, and even if she wasn't, she'd be dead by now." Sarah's laugh was soft as desert wind through sage. Legends do have a way of persisting, don't they? Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, settled on each man in turn. Though I have to say, outlaws had better manners in my day, would have tipped their hats to a lady at least before trying to rob her. Inside Murphy's store, Billy had edged closer to the window, his heart pounding. His father appeared beside him, laying a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Watch close, son," the elder Murphy whispered. "You might never see anything like this again." The younger outlaw, nervous energy getting the better of him, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "This is crazy, boss. She's just some old woman. Let's just take the brooch and just an old woman." Sarah's voice carried clearly, despite its softness. "Tell me, young man, did your pa ever mention the Clayton gang? 5 men who thought they could rob the Tucson bank back in '63? She adjusted her shawl with deliberate care. "I hear 3 of them can almost walk normally now." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. The viper's face darkened with rage, but Pete had gone pale, recognition flooding his features. "Boss, I remember now. My pa showed me a poster once. She shot the guns right out of their hands, all 5 of them. Said she could hit a running jackrabbit at 100 yards. "That was a long time ago," Sarah continued, her tone almost conversational. "These days, I spend most mornings tending my garden. The desert roses need particular care, you know. Delicate things." Her right hand moved slowly to adjust her basket. "But it's funny about muscle memory. Some things you never quite forget." More townsfolk had begun to gather at a safe distance, drawn by the tension in the air. Among them stood old Tom Fletcher, who'd been just a boy when he'd witnessed Sarah's legendary shooting contest with Alan McGraw. He nudged his companion, speaking in a carrying whisper. 25 years ago, I saw her shoot a silver dollar at 50 paces, hit it dead center while it was spinning in the air." The viper's face twisted with frustration. "I don't care if she's Buffalo Bill himself. There's 3 of us, we've got guns, and she's got nothing but a market basket and memories." Sarah sighed softly, like a schoolteacher disappointed in a slow student. 3 guns, yes. The Colt on your hip's seen better days. The cylinders. Wearing loose, I can hear it when you move. Pete's carrying a Smith & Wesson, well maintained, but the front sight's off by a hair to the left. And your young friend there has what looks like a cheap army surplus revolver that probably pulls high and right. The outlaws stared at her, stunned by the precision of her observations. Even the viper took an unconscious step backward. "As for memories," she continued, her hand moving to touch the silver brooch at her throat, "some are sharper than others, like the memory of where exactly I keep my Winchester these days." The younger outlaw's eyes darted to the basket she carried, but Sarah's laugh stopped him cold. "Oh no, child. Not in there. That's just carrying my sewing and some fresh bread. And from the baker's." Her smile took on an edge like a well-honed knife, the rifles much closer than that. Thunder crashed again, closer now, and a gust of wind set the boardwalk creaking. In that moment, Sarah's dress shifted again, revealing not just the glint of metal at her ankle, but the distinctive curved lever of a mare's leg, a shortened Winchester rifle, cunningly strapped and hidden beneath her skirts. The viper's eyes widened as he finally understood the gravity of his mistake. He was no longer facing a helpless old woman. He was standing before a legend that had been quietly waiting for just such a moment to remind the world why some reputations never truly fade. In the sheriff's office, Deputy Wilson leaned forward, tension evident in every line of his body. "Sir, shouldn't we—" "Quiet, son," Cooper interrupted softly. "The show's about to begin." What happened next would be retold in Rattlesnake Junction's saloons for decades to come. The viper, his pride stung by the revelation of Sarah's identity and her cool assessment of his weapon, made the fatal mistake of trying to prove her wrong. His hand dropped to his gun, fingers curling around the worn grip. "Don't matter what you used to be," he snarled. "You're still just an old woman, and this is still a working gun." Sarah's movements were so smooth, so practiced, they seemed almost casual. The basket slipped from her arm, caught perfectly on her foot, and was gently kicked backward, sliding to safety against Murphy's storefront. Her right hand hadn't moved yet, but her posture had shifted subtly. Weight balanced just so, years, seeming to fall away from her frame. "Last chance, boys," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the tension-filled air. "Walk away. Go find some other town to trouble. I've already dug more graves than I care to count." The younger outlaw, panic finally overwhelming his judgment, went for his gun first. It was exactly the wrong move. Sarah's hand dropped, her dress swirling with the motion, and the mare's leg seemed to materialize in her grip, as if conjured there by magic. What followed was what old Tom Fletcher would later describe as swift shot's symphony in 3 movements. The first shot caught the young man's gun just as it cleared his holster, sending it spinning into the dust. The second bullet struck Pete's weapon with surgical precision before his fingers had even closed around the grip. The third shot, and this was the one that would be talked about for years, caught the viper's colt exactly where Sarah had noted the loose cylinder, splitting the pin and causing the whole mechanism to fall apart in his hands. 3 shots, 3 guns destroyed, not a drop of blood spilled. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds. Thunder crashed overhead, and the first real drops of rain began to fall, pattering on the boardwalk like scattered applause. The 3 outlaws stood frozen, staring at their ruined weapons, unable to process what had just happened. Sarah hadn't moved from her spot, the mare's leg held steady in hands that showed not a tremor of age. "You'll notice," she said calmly, "I didn't aim for flesh. That was a courtesy, one I extend exactly once. The next 3 shots?" She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, let's just say I don't always aim for the guns." From his vantage point in the store, Billy Murphy found his voice. "Pa," he whispered, I thought those stories were just tall tales." His father shook his head, eyes never leaving the scene outside. "No, son. If anything, the stories didn't do her justice. I once saw her put 6 shots through the same hole at 30 paces. Said it was just a matter of rhythm and breathing." The viper, his face a mask of rage and disbelief, took a stumbling step backward. "This ain't possible," he growled. "You're supposed to be a myth, a campfire story. To scare greenhorns." "Oh, I'm quite real," Sarah replied, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "Just like the 14 notches on this rifle stock are real. Each one's a story of someone who thought age had slowed my trigger finger." She adjusted her grip slightly. "Care to make it 17? Pete, showing more wisdom than his boss, slowly raised his hands. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I believe we owe you an apology. Several, in fact. With your permission, we'll be leaving town now. Won't trouble you or anyone else here again." The younger outlaw nodded frantically, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Swear to God, ma'am, we'll ride straight through to California if you say so." Sarah's eyes, sharp as ever, studied each man in turn. The rain was falling steadily now, drawing out the desert's rich scent of creosote and sage. Finally, she nodded, though the mare's leg didn't waver. "Sheriff Cooper," she called out, not taking her eyes off the outlaws. "I believe these gentlemen are ready to have a conversation about those bank robberies you've been investigating." In the sheriff's office, Cooper smiled and finally stood, adjusting his badge. "I do believe you're right, Miss Sarah." He turned to his stunned deputy. "Wilson, let's go help the lady escort these fine fellows to our accommodations. And son?" "Yes, sir? Remember what you just saw. Some legends don't fade. They just wait for the right moment to remind us why they became legends in the first place." The rain fell steadily over Rattlesnake Junction as Sheriff Cooper and Deputy Wilson led the three chastened outlaws toward the jail. The Viper, his previous bravado shattered like his gun cylinder, walked with the stunned expression of a man who'd just seen his whole worldview turned upside down. Behind them, Sarah Hawkins calmly retrieved her basket from where it had slid against Murphy's storefront, the mare's leg now hidden once more beneath her skirts. The gathering crowd of townsfolk watched in amazed silence as she straightened her shawl, adjusted her silver brooch, and began collecting the scattered pieces of the outlaws' ruined weapons. Each movement was precise, deliberate, showing none of the shakiness one might expect from elderly hands that had just performed such extraordinary feats. Billy Murphy burst out of the store, unable to contain his excitement any longer. "Miss Sarah, that was... He struggled to find words adequate to describe what he'd witnessed. "How did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah's smile was gentle now, more like the kind grandmother the town was used to seeing. "Practice, a child, hours upon hours of practice." She examined one of the ruined guns with professional interest. "My father was a gunsmith in St. Louis, taught me that understanding the weapon was just as important as being able to use it." Tom Fletcher stepped forward, helping her gather the last pieces. "I remember the stories about your father's shop. Miss Sarah, they said he could diagnose a gun's problems just by listening to it fire." "That he could," Sarah agreed, her eyes distant with memory. "James Whitaker was his name, though most folks just called him the Doctor. He could heal any ailing firearm brought to him." Her fingers traced the damaged cylinder of the Viper's Colt. "Shame about this one. Fine weapon once, before neglect set in." Rebecca Anderson, the schoolteacher, pushed through the crowd with her class in tow. They'd been having a lesson in the schoolhouse when the excitement began. "Miss Sarah," she said hesitantly, I hope you won't think me forward, but would you consider speaking to my students sometime about the early days of the territory?" Sarah tucked a stray strand of silver hair back into place. "Perhaps, though I suspect they're more interested in hearing about gunfights than proper weapon maintenance and the importance of daily practice." "Both," piped up young Tommy Wilson, the deputy's son. "Pa says you were in Buffalo Bill's show." "Almost was," Sarah corrected gently. "Mr. Cody made a generous offer, but I had other commitments." Her hand touched the silver brooch again, and those closest saw a flash of something in her eyes, grief perhaps, or just the weight of memories. "My James was ailing by then, needed me more than the spotlight did." Inside the jail, they could hear the Viper's voice rising in protest. "You don't understand. That wasn't natural. No one can shoot like that, let alone some old woman." Sarah shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Young men," she said to no one in particular, "always thinking age takes everything. They never consider what it might give in return." Murphy Sr., who'd finally emerged from his store, raised an eyebrow. "And what's that, Miss Sarah?" Patience, she replied, starting to make her way home through the rain. Experience, the wisdom to know exactly when to strike and how hard. She paused, looking back at the gathered crowd. And most importantly, the knowledge that reputation alone can sometimes prevent bloodshed better than any bullet. As she walked away, her figure straight and dignified despite the years, the townsfolk began to disperse, though knots of people remained, already beginning to recount what they'd witnessed. The story would grow in the telling, as such stories do. But for once, the truth was every bit as remarkable as the embellishments. Billy Murphy watched her go, then turned to his father. "Pa, why'd she never tell anyone? About who she really was, I mean." The elder Murphy smiled, watching Sarah's retreating form. "Son, the truly dangerous ones never have to advertise. They're content to let others do the talking while they tend their gardens and bake their pies, until someone makes the mistake of thinking age has tamed them." Thunder rolled once more across the desert, softer now, like nature itself applauding the performance it had just witnessed. In his office, Sheriff Cooper was about to discover that the Viper and his companions weren't just small-time bandits. They were advanced scouts for something far more dangerous heading toward Rattlesnake Junction. And Sarah Hawkins's day of reckoning with the past was far from over. Sheriff Cooper sat behind his desk, studying the wanted posters spread before him with growing concern. The afternoon rain had passed, leaving behind that peculiar desert clarity that made every detail sharp as broken glass. Deputy Wilson stood nervously by the window, watching the Viper and his companions in their cells. "Talk," Cooper commanded, his voice hard as trail leather. The Viper, his earlier bravado completely deflated by his encounter with Sarah Hawkins, shifted uncomfortably on his bunk. "You don't understand, Sheriff. When Blackjack McCullough finds out what happened here..." Blackjack McCullough? Wilson's head snapped around. Even he knew that name. The notorious outlaw had cut a bloody swath across 3 territories, leaving 37 dead in his wake. "He sent us to scout the town," Pete volunteered from his cell, ignoring the Viper's glare. "Said it looked like easy pickings. Bank's got a big gold shipment coming through next week, mining payroll." Cooper's face remained impassive, but his fingers drummed a troubled rhythm on his desk. "And McCullough, where is he now?" "2 days' ride east," the young outlaw piped up, eager to cooperate after his brush with legend. "Holed up in the old Carson mine with 20 men. Mean ones, too. Killers, all of them. Outside the jail, the setting sun painted Rattlesnake Junction in shades of amber and shadow. Sarah Hawkins sat on her porch, the mare's leg across her lap as she methodically cleaned and oiled it. The familiar ritual helped quiet her mind, though her thoughts kept drifting back to another confrontation 20 years ago when she'd first crossed paths with Blackjack McCullough. She'd been younger then, still performing occasionally in shooting exhibitions. McCullough had been in the crowd, watching with those cold snake eyes of his. After the show, he'd approached her with a proposition: join his gang, use her skills for profit instead of entertainment. She'd declined, of course. The next day, she'd found her horse dead in its stall, its throat cut. The soft crunch of boots on gravel brought her back to the present. Sheriff Cooper stood at her gate, his expression grave. "Evening, Miss Sarah. Mind if I join you?" She gestured to the empty rocking chair beside her. "Thomas Cooper," she said softly, "you've got that same look your father used to get when trouble was brewing." Cooper settled into the chair with a tired sigh. "You've heard of Blackjack McCullough?" "Heard of him?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Let's just say we have history." Her hands never stopped their methodical work on the rifle. "He's coming, isn't he?" 2 days out. 20 men. Cooper watched her face carefully. "Bank's got a big payroll coming through. Mining money," Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "And now his advanced scouts have seen what happened today. He'll know I'm here." She sighted down the mare's leg's barrel, checking the alignment. "Did you know he used to be an Army scout? Learn to read sign like an Apache. He'll have heard every detail about today's excitement before sunset tomorrow. Miss Sarah. Cooper hesitated. The town's not defenseless. We've got some good men, she interrupted gently, aren't enough against the likes of McCullough. He doesn't just rob and kill. He breaks things, places people, takes pride in it. The sheriff leaned forward. Then help us. Train some of the townsmen. With your experience, 2 days isn't enough to turn shopkeepers into gunfighters, Thomas. Sarah's voice was kind but firm. And McCullough, he's not like those boys today. He won't underestimate me because of my age. He's seen what I can do. The last rays of sunlight caught her silver brooch, making the shooting star design seem to flare. No, she continued. This needs to be handled differently, more subtle-like. A ghost of her earlier smile touched her lips. Fortunately, age teaches you patience and timing. Cooper studied her face in the gathering dusk. You've got a plan? The beginnings of one. Sarah finished with the rifle and set it aside. But first, I need you to send a telegram. There's someone who needs to know what's coming. Her eyes took on a distant look. Someone who owes me a favor from the old days. As night settled over Rattlesnake Junction, lights began to twinkle in windows like earthbound stars. In her rocking chair, Sarah Hawkins watched the darkness deepen, her mind turning over possibilities like cards in a deck. The legend of Swift. Shot Sarah was about to add another chapter, but this time the stakes were higher than just her own survival. Dawn broke over Rattlesnake Junction like a cracked egg, spilling golden light across the desert. Sarah Hawkins was already awake, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. Spread before her was an old leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Her fingers traced the faded writing as memories stirred like dust devils in her mind. The telegram had gone out last night, its message simple. Swift shot calls in Carson City marker. Black Jack riding. 2 days. Rattlesnake Junction. Now all she could do was wait and hope that some debts truly never expired. A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Rebecca Anderson, the schoolteacher, stood on her porch, clutching a newspaper. Miss Sarah, I thought you should see this. She handed over the week-old Phoenix Gazette, folded to show a particular article. It's about McCullough's last raid. Sarah scanned the article, her expression growing harder with each line. The town of Mesa Creek had resisted Blackjack's gang. In response, he'd burned their church during Sunday services. That's his way, she said softly. Always has been. It's not enough for him to take what he wants. He has to break people's spirit too. The children are scared, Rebecca admitted. Words spreading about what's coming. Some families are already talking about leaving town until it's over. Sarah closed her journal with deliberate care. Better they leave than stay and risk McCullough's kind of justice. She stood, moving to the window where her Winchester hung on pegs recently, cleaned and loaded. But you didn't just come here to show me the newspaper, did you? Rebecca straightened her spine. I want to learn to shoot, not like you. I know that takes years, but enough to defend myself, to protect my students if it comes to that. A shadow of a smile crossed Sarah's face. Your father was Grant Anderson, wasn't he? Rode with the Texas Rangers? Yes, but he died when I was young. Never taught me about guns, but he taught you about courage. Sarah lifted the Winchester from its pegs. Come on, we've got work to do. At the sheriff's office, Cooper was interviewing the Viper again when hoofbeats drew his attention. A lone rider was approaching from the east, dust trailing behind him. Like a banner, Cooper's hand dropped to his gun, but there was something familiar about the rider's bearing. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace that belied his gray hair and weathered face. His duster was trail-worn, but the matched Colts on his hips gleamed with careful maintenance. Marcus Kane, He introduced himself simply. "Got Sarah's telegram." Cooper's eyes widened slightly. Marcus Lightning Kane was almost as legendary as Swiftshot Sarah herself. They'd been a formidable team in the old days, before age and tragedy had sent them down different paths. "You rode all night?" Kane's smile was ghost-quick. "Some debts you don't hesitate to pay. Where is she?" "Teaching the schoolmarm to shoot, if you can believe it." "I can believe anything about Sarah Hawkins," Kane replied. "Saw her shoot a rattler's head off at 30 paces once in the dark, using just the sound it made. At the makeshift shooting range behind Sarah's house, Rebecca was learning the fundamentals." "Breathe," Sarah instructed, adjusting her stance. "The trigger pull should surprise you, like the first drop of rain on your face." The crack of Rebecca's shot was followed by the ping of a tin can being knocked off the fence. The schoolteacher's face lit up with surprise and accomplishment. "Well," a new voice drawled, "you haven't lost your touch for teaching, Sarah." Sarah turned, her movements deliberately casual, but Cooper noticed her right hand stayed near the mare's leg concealed in her skirts. When she saw Kane, however, her face softened with recognition. "Took you long enough, Lightning." "Had to finish a game of poker first," he replied with a wink. Then his expression turned serious. "McCullough?" "Coming, with 20 men." Kane nodded, thoughtfully. "Like old times then, though we're a bit longer in the tooth." "Older," Sarah agreed, "but maybe wiser too." She glanced at Rebecca, then back to Kane. "I've got a plan, but it's going to take timing and trust." "You always did like your plans complicated," Kane said with a faint smile. "Remember Dodge City?" "Remember who saved your hide in Dodge City," Sarah retorted, but there was warmth in her voice. As the morning sun climbed higher, 3 generations of frontier justice, Sarah, Kane, and Rebecca, stood in the shadow of an old woman's house, preparing to write a new chapter in the legend of Swiftshot Sarah. And somewhere to the east, Black Jack McCullough and his gang were riding hard toward Rattlesnake Junction, unaware that they were galloping straight into a trap laid by a master. The afternoon sun beat down on Rattlesnake Junction like a blacksmith's hammer, as Sarah Hawkins, Marcus Kane, and Sheriff Cooper gathered in the back room of Murphy's store. Spread across a table was a rough map of the town, weighted down with spent shell casings. Sarah's fingers traced the routes into town with the precision of a general planning a campaign. "McCullough's not just a killer," she explained, her voice carrying the weight of old knowledge. "He was a cavalry sergeant before the war, knows tactics. He'll have men watching every exit from town before he makes his move." Kane nodded, his weathered face grave. 20 men's a lot of firepower for a bank job, even for Black Jack." "It's not just about the money," Sarah replied, shifting one of the shell casings on the map. "He's got a reputation to maintain after what happened with his scouts." She glanced at Cooper. "How are our guests doing, Sheriff?" "Nervous," Cooper answered. "The Viper keeps asking for extra protection, says McCullough doesn't tolerate failure." Sarah's smile was cold as desert frost. "He's right about that at least. I once saw McCullough shoot his own brother for missing a stagecoach robbery." She adjusted her shawl, the mare's leg hidden beneath shifting slightly. "That's why this has to be perfect. We're not just protecting the bank, we're protecting the whole town." Outside, Deputy Wilson was organizing volunteers, teaching basic firearms, handling under Rebecca's surprisingly capable instruction. The schoolteacher had proven to be a quick study, her father's blood showing through in her steady hands and calm voice. "Keep your breathing even," she instructed Tom Fletcher's teenage son. "Like Miss Sarah says, the shot should surprise you, not the other way around." Back in the storeroom, Kane was studying the map intently. "You've got something specific in mind, don't you, Sarah? That look in your eye hasn't changed in 20 years. McCullough expects a frontal defense," Sarah explained. "Men on rooftops, barricades in the streets, traditional thinking." Her fingers tapped the shell casing marking the bank. "So that's exactly what we'll give him." At first, Cooper leaned forward, but McCullough's got a blind spot, always has had. Sarah's eyes took on a distant look. He thinks of women as decorations, property. Even after what happened in Dodge City, he never learned. Kane chuckled softly. Dodge City. When you and Kate Deadeye Williams took down the entire Thompson gang while the men were busy watching the saloon. Kate's teaching shooting in California now, Sarah mused. Wish she was here, but we've got something just as good. She nodded. Toward the window where Rebecca was correcting another volunteer's stance. McCullough won't see them coming, won't even think to look. The plan began to take shape as the afternoon wore on. Billy Murphy, eager to help, brought reports of other townswomen joining Rebecca's impromptu shooting lessons. Eleanor Turner, the baker's wife, had surprised everyone by hitting 8 bottles in a row. Even Mrs. Cooper, the sheriff's usually gentle spouse, was practicing with a shotgun in her back garden. Like a hidden army, Kane observed, watching through the window. But Sarah, they're still newcomers to shooting, against McCullough's killers. They don't need to be perfect, Sarah interrupted. They just need to be unexpected. Create confusion. Divide attention. She patted the mare's leg under her skirt. The real work will be done by others. Cooper studied the old woman's face, seeing past the silver hair and wrinkles to the legend beneath. You're going to face him yourself, aren't you? Draw him out. McCullough and I have unfinished business, Sarah admitted. From before Dodge City, before he killed my James. Her hand touched the silver brooch at her throat. Sometimes old debts can only be settled one way. As evening approached, more riders arrived, experienced lawmen answering Cooper's urgent telegrams. Each one did a double-take upon seeing Sarah Hawkins, the legend they'd heard about for years, calmly serving coffee and cookies while discussing combat tactics. Remember, she told them, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, McCullough's expecting a legend. An old woman past her prime, trying to relive past glories. Her smile held the promise of steel. Let's show him how dangerous assumptions can be. The sun was setting over Rattlesnake Junction, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. In less than 24 hours, Blackjack McCullough and his gang would arrive, expecting to find an easy target. Instead, they would ride into a trap, laid by a master strategist who had learned that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a gun. It's being underestimated. Night settled over Rattlesnake Junction like a crow's wing, bringing with it the desert's bitter cold. In Sarah Hawkins's kitchen, lamplight spilled across her table where she sat with Marcus Kane, sharing a pot of coffee and memories. The mare's leg rested within easy reach, its well-worn stock reflecting the soft light. Remember that shooting contest in Santa Fe? Kane asked, his voice carrying the warmth of old friendship. When you outshot that fancy Eastern trick shooter, Sarah's smile was gentle. Maxwell Hughes called himself the Boston Wonder, had all those fancy silver-plated guns. She sipped her coffee. Never did understand why men think decorating a weapon makes it shoot straighter. He cried foul when you beat him with that plain old Winchester, until James stepped in. Sarah's hand went to her silver brooch, as it often did when speaking of her late husband. Offered to let Hughes examine the rifle, prove there were no tricks. Her eyes grew distant. James always knew how to handle proud men without hurting. Their pride, outside the town, was quietly preparing for tomorrow. Through the window, they could see Rebecca Anderson and Eleanor Turner leading a group of women in quiet practice behind the church, their shots muffled by heavy blankets set up as backstops. The schoolteacher had proven to be an excellent instructor, patient but demanding. They're not ready, Kane observed, though his tone held admiration rather than criticism. Not for the kind of violence McCullough brings. They don't need to be perfect, Sarah replied, echoing her earlier words. Just determined, and they've got reason to be. She stood, moving to the window. McCullers made a career of breaking people's spirit, making them feel helpless. Her voice hardened. That stops here. At the jail, Sheriff Cooper was interviewing the Viper again, trying to glean any final details about McCullers' tactics. The outlaw had grown increasingly nervous as the hours ticked by. "You don't understand," he insisted, pacing his cell. "When Blackjack finds out about the old woman, about what she did to us, he'll burn this whole town just to prove a point." "Like Mesa Creek?" Cooper asked quietly. The Viper stopped pacing. "Who told you about Mesa Creek?" "News travels." "Even out here?" Cooper leaned forward. "Tell me about the church." In her bedroom, Sarah opened an old trunk, its hinges creaking with age. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay her exhibition outfit from her performing days, a fringed leather jacket adorned with silver conchos, matching skirt, and a wide-brimmed hat with a single eagle feather. Her fingers traced the leather, remembering. "Going to wear it tomorrow?" Kane asked from the doorway. "No." Sarah carefully rewrapped the outfit. "That was for show. Tomorrow's for survival." She straightened, and for a moment Kane saw past the silver hair and lined face to the legend he'd known in their prime. McCullough expects swift-shot Sarah, the performer. He'll get something else entirely. At the bank, Deputy Wilson supervised as volunteers reinforced the windows and doors. But Sarah had been clear. The bank wasn't the real target. McCullough would expect them to concentrate their defense there. The true battle would happen elsewhere. Rebecca Anderson appeared at Sarah's door close to midnight, her face flushed. "From practice. Miss Sarah, the women are ready." "Well, as ready as we can be." Sarah studied the younger woman thoughtfully. "Your father would be proud, Rebecca. Grant Anderson never backed down from a fight either." "I wish." Rebecca hesitated. "I wish he could have taught me himself." "He taught you something more important." Sarah touched the younger woman's shoulder. "He taught you to stand up. The shooting, that's just details." As midnight passed, the town held its breath. Tomorrow would bring violence, that was certain. But as Sarah Hawkins made her final preparations, checking ammunition and testing sightlines, she felt an unfamiliar emotion. Hope. Not just for survival, but for something more. A chance to show that even in the savage frontier, courage and determination could stand against brute force and terror. "Get some rest," she told Kane as he headed to his borrowed room. "Tomorrow, we remind McCullough why some legends don't fade. They just get more dangerous with age." Dawn crept over the horizon like a cautious coyote, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold. Sarah Hawkins stood on her porch, sipping her morning coffee, when Billy Murphy came running up the street, kicking up dust with every stride. His young face was flushed with excitement and fear. "Miss Sarah, riders coming." About 5 miles out, Sarah set her coffee cup down with deliberate care. "How many?" "Scout spotted at least 25, Billy panted. "More than we expected." "McCullers recruited extra guns." She nodded, unsurprised. "He always did like to stack the odds." Her hand moved to the mare's leg concealed beneath her skirt. "Tell Sheriff Cooper it's time. Everyone to their positions." The town had been preparing for this moment since yesterday. As Sarah watched, women and children began moving quietly toward the church basement, guided by Eleanor Turner. But not all the women were seeking shelter. Rebecca Anderson and her group of newly trained shooters were taking up their hidden positions just as they'd practiced. Marcus Kane appeared at her side, his twin Colts gleaming in the morning light. "Like old times," he said softly. "Better." "Hope not," Sarah replied with a grim smile. "Last time we faced odds like this, you got shot twice. Worth it to see you shoot that cigar out of Carlton's mouth at 50 paces. Kane's eyes scanned the street. "You sure about this plan?" Sarah's response was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Through her old brass spyglass, she could make out the dust cloud approaching from the east. McCullough's gang was riding hard, confident in their numbers and reputation. "To your position," she told Kane. "Remember, let them think they've got us outflanked. Everything depends on timing." As Kane moved off, Sarah settled into her rocking chair, looking for all the world like nothing more than an elderly woman enjoying the morning sun. But her eyes, sharp as ever, caught every detail of the approaching force. They came in 3 groups, just as she'd predicted. The main force, led by a giant of a man Sarah recognized as Blackjack McCullough himself, rode straight down the center of town. 2 smaller groups split off, trying to circle behind the buildings. Classic cavalry tactics, just like she'd told Cooper. McCullough reined up in the center of the street, his black duster catching the morning breeze. 20 years hadn't changed him much. Still the same cold eyes, the same cruel set to his mouth. His voice boomed across the seemingly empty street. "Come out, Cooper! We know you're hiding behind those walls. Make it easy on yourself." Sarah counted silently. By now, Rebecca's shooters would be in position. Cooper's men would be watching from their hidden spots. Everything was ready. She stood slowly, making a show of steadying herself on her porch rail. "Why Jack McCullough?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "You're looking well for a man I last saw running away from a woman with a rifle." The effect was electric. McCullough's head snapped around, his eyes widening, as he recognized her. "Swift shot Sarah," he breathed, then laughed harshly. Well, the years haven't been kind, have they?" "Kind enough," Sarah replied, taking a careful step forward. "I can still shoot straight. Want a demonstration, like the one I gave your advanced scouts?" McCullough's face darkened at the reminder of his humiliated men. "You're not facing 3. Greenhorns now, old woman. I've got 25 killers with me." 23, Sarah corrected calmly. "You lost 2, trying to sneak through the wash behind the livery. My friend Mr. Kane sends his regards." Right on cue, 2 shots rang out from the direction she'd indicated. McCullough's head whipped around as 2 of his men fell from their saddles. He caught completely by surprise. "First blood's ours, Jack," Sarah said softly, though her voice carried in the sudden silence. "Want to see what else this old woman can do?" McCullough's response was a roar of rage and a single word. "Kill them, all." The battle for Rattlesnake Junction was about to begin in earnest. But Sarah Hawkins had already achieved her first objective, making Blackjack McCullough lose his temper. An angry man makes mistakes, and she was counting on every single one of them. The morning exploded into chaos as McCullough's men opened fire, their bullets splintering wood and shattering windows. Sarah Hawkins moved with surprising agility for her age, ducking behind a sturdy porch post as lead whistled past. But even as she took cover, a small smile played at her lips. McCullough's men were shooting wild, angry, exactly as she'd planned. "Watch your ammunition, boys!" McCullough bellowed from his horse. "The bank's the real target. This is just some old woman's last stand." That's when Rebecca Anderson's group sprang their first surprise. From hidden positions in second-story windows, the town's women opened fire with carefully aimed shots. They weren't trying to kill, most of them weren't ready for that, but their targets were chosen with precision. Horses reared as bullets struck near their hooves, throwing riders off balance. Gun hands were forced to duck as shots cracked too close for comfort. "Women?" McCullough's face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You armed the women?" Sarah's voice carried clearly over the gunfire. "They armed themselves, Jack. Turns out they didn't much like your reputation with the fairer sex." Kane's voice joined the symphony of gunfire from a new position, his twin Colts speaking with deadly accuracy. 2 more of McCullough's men fell, while others scrambled for whatever cover they could find. The carefully orchestrated chaos was having its effect. Instead of an organized assault, the gang was splitting up, reacting to threats from multiple directions. "Sarah!" Rebecca called from her position. "Riders trying to circle around back." "Right on schedule," Sarah murmured. She raised her voice. "Sheriff, the signal!" Cooper's shotgun boomed from the church tower, and suddenly the streets were filled with thick grey smoke. The town's children had spent yesterday gathering tumbleweeds, soaking them in wet blankets. Now, set strategically alight, they created a dense screen that played havoc with visibility. Through the smoke, Sarah moved like a ghost, the mare's leg appearing in her hands as if by magic. Her first shot caught a flanking rider in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. The second disarmed another who was drawing a bead on Kane's position. Each shot was precise, deliberate yet fast as summer lightning. "She's toying with us," one of McCullough's men shouted, panic evident in his voice. "Just like the stories said." "Stories?" McCullough snarled. "She's one old woman. Push through to the bank." But that's when Sarah's trap truly sprung. As the gang tried to regroup for a charge, Eleanor Turner's group opened up from concealed positions near the bank, not with guns, but with mirrors. The morning sun, caught and reflected with devastating accuracy, blinded the attackers at crucial moments. In the confusion, more of the town's defenders found their marks. McCullough's organized assault had devolved into a series of individual firefights, exactly as Sarah had planned. The gang's superior numbers meant nothing when they couldn't bring their full force to bear at once. "Jack McCullough," Sarah's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Still think I'm just some old woman living on past glories?" A bullet splintered the post near her head. McCullough had spotted her through the smoke. His shot was good, but Sarah's response was better. The mare's leg barked once, and McCullough's hat went spinning away, a neat hole drilled through its crown. "That's one," she called out calmly. "Want to see what else I remember from the old days?" Kane's voice drifted through the smoke. "Sarah, 8 of them are breaking off, heading east." "Let them go," she replied. "They're not the ones we want." McCullough's laugh was harsh as broken glass. "You think this is a victory? You think picking off a few of my men changes anything? I've still got enough killers to burn this town to the ground." "No, Jack," Sarah's voice was almost gentle. "You've got exactly what I wanted you to have. The men who are running, they're the smart ones. The ones still with you, they're about to learn why some legends don't retire. They just wait for the right moment." The smoke was beginning to clear now, revealing the changed battlefield. McCullough had started with 25 men. Now he had barely 12. And those were looking increasingly uncertain. But Black Jack himself sat tall in his saddle, rage making him dangerous as a wounded bear. The real battle was about to begin, and Sarah Hawkins was finally ready to settle an old debt. The smoke drifted away on the morning breeze, revealing the changed landscape of Rattlesnake Junction. The street was littered with spent cartridges, wounded men, and abandoned horses. McCullough's remaining followers had taken cover behind water, troughs and wagon wheels, their earlier bravado replaced by wary calculation. Sarah Hawkins stood in plain view on her porch, the mare's leg held easy in her hands. There was something different about her stance now. The carefully maintained illusion of age and frailty had fallen away completely, revealing the legend beneath. "You know what your mistake was, Jack?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly, in the tension-filled air. "Same one you made 20 years ago. You never could see past your own assumptions." McCullough's face was a mask of fury as he dismounted, keeping his horse between himself and Sarah's position. "My mistake?" he snarled. "I'm not the one who's about to die, old woman. That's exactly what I mean." Sarah's smile was cold as desert frost, still thinking like a cavalryman, still sure that age and gender matter more than experience. She took a deliberate step forward. "Want to know what I've been doing these past 20 years, Jack? Besides tending my garden and baking pies?" Through the settling dust, Rebecca Anderson's voice rang out. "Clear shot on 3 more, Miss Sarah. Just say the word." McCullough's head snapped around, trying to locate the shooter. His remaining men looked increasingly nervous, unsure where the next threat would come from. "I've been teaching," Sarah continued, taking another step. "Passing on what I know. This town isn't defended by one old legend, Jack. It's protected by dozens of people who've learned that courage matters more than swagger." Her voice hardened. "People who remember what you did to James." Kane's voice drifted from somewhere to the left. "Just like old times, Sarah. Want me to take the shot?" "No," Sarah replied, never taking her eyes off McCullough. "This one's personal. Has been since Mesa Creek." McCullough's laugh was harsh. "Mesa Creek? That dry gulch wasn't worth saving, just like this town isn't." "It wasn't about the town, Jack." Sarah's fingers flexed on the mare's leg's grip. "It was about James. He was there investigating the bank robberies. He knew it was you behind them, and you—" Her voice caught just for a moment. "You burned him alive in that hotel, left your calling card so I'd know who did it." Understanding dawned in McCullough's eyes. "The famous swift-shot Sarah," he sneered, "gave up the spotlight to become a grieving widow." "How perfect. Not grieving," Sarah corrected. "Waiting, learning, teaching others how to stand against men like you." She nodded slightly, and suddenly McCullough realized his remaining men were being systematically disarmed by precise shots from multiple directions. Not killing shots, just careful surgical strikes that left guns spinning in the dust. "You see, Jack," Sarah continued, "a performance shooter knows all about putting on a show, about making people see what they expect to see. A quiet widow, tending her garden. That's quite a show. But now it's time for the final act." McCullough's hand dropped to his gun. "You're still just one old woman with a cut-down rifle." "No." Sarah's movement was like lightning, the mare's leg seeming to materialize at her shoulder. "I'm Swift-Shot Sarah, the woman you should have finished all those years ago." The air grew thick with tension as two legends faced each other across the bullet-scarred street. McCullough's remaining men, those still conscious, pressed themselves deeper into cover, recognizing the moment for what it was. Not just a gunfight, but the resolution of a 20-year debt. "Last chance, Jack," Sarah offered, her voice almost gentle. "Surrender to the sheriff. Face a proper trial." McCullough's response was a snarl of rage and a blur of motion as his gun cleared leather. But he was facing a woman who had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, who had practiced every day while appearing to do nothing but tend flowers and bake bread. The legend of Swift-Shot Sarah was about to add its final chapter, and black. Jack McCullough was about to learn why some debts can only be paid in lead. Time seemed to slow as McCullough's gun cleared leather. He was fast. Reputation hadn't lied about that. His draw was a blur of motion that had sent dozens of men to their graves. But he was facing a woman who had turned shooting into an art form, who had spent 20 years keeping her skills honed to a razor's edge, while the world saw only an aging widow. The mare's leg in Sarah's hands spoke first, its report sharp as desert thunder. McCullough's gun went spinning away, a precise shot having caught it at the cylinder, destroying the mechanism completely. Before he could process what had happened, 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession. The first took his gun belt, sending it dropping to the dust. The second put a neat hole through the brim of his hat, exactly between his eyes. 3 shots, Sarah said softly. "Just like the old days. Want to try for 4? McCullough stood frozen, his gun hand bleeding where the flying pieces of his destroyed revolver had cut him. For the first time, real fear showed in his eyes. "That's not possible," he whispered. "Nobody's that fast. Not at your age." Age. Sarah's laugh was cold as mountain wind. "You still don't understand, do you, Jack? Age doesn't slow down skill. It distills it, purifies it." She took a step forward, the mare's leg never wavering. Every morning for 20 years, while everyone thought I was tending my garden, I was practicing. Every afternoon while they thought I was baking, I was shooting. 500 rounds a day, minimum. Kane's voice drifted from his position. She's being modest, McCullough. Should have seen her last winter, shooting coins out of the air during a snowstorm, just to keep sharp. Rebecca emerged from her hiding spot, her rifle trained steadily on McCullough's remaining men. She taught us more than just shooting, the schoolteacher added. She taught us about patience, about waiting for the right moment. Sarah's eyes never left McCullough's face. You want to know the funny thing, Jack? I could have killed you any time in the last 5 minutes, could have put a bullet through your black heart the moment you rode into town. The mare's leg shifted slightly, but that wouldn't have been enough. I wanted you to know, to understand exactly who was beating you. McCullough's face twisted with rage. You think this changes anything? You think killing me will bring your precious James back? No. Sarah's voice was surprisingly gentle. Nothing brings back the dead, Jack, but sometimes the living need to be reminded that there's still justice in the world, that sometimes it comes from unexpected places. That's when McCullough made his final mistake. His left hand dropped to his boot, reaching for the derringer hidden there. It was a desperate move, one that had saved him before, but Sarah had been waiting for it, had known he'd try something exactly like this. The mare's leg spoke one last time. The derringer went spinning away, along with 2 of McCullough's fingers. He fell to his knees, clutching his maimed hand, all pretense of bravado gone. That's 4, Sarah said quietly. I've got 2 shots left. Care to try for 6? The remaining outlaws, seeing their legendary leader brought low by an elderly woman, began throwing down their weapons. Sheriff Cooper and his deputies moved in, beginning the process of rounding up prisoners. The battle for Rattlesnake Junction was over. Sarah finally lowered the mare's leg, feeling every one of her years in her tired muscles. But her eyes were clear and bright as she looked at the fallen McCullough. You'll stand trial this time, Jack, for James, for Mesa Creek, for all of it. As Cooper's deputies led McCullough away, Kane approached his old friend. Quite a show, Sarah. Just like the old days. Better than the old days, she corrected, watching as Rebecca organized the townswomen to help tend the wounded. Back then, it was just about showing off. Today was about something more important. Justice. Teaching. Sarah smiled, and for the first time that day it reached her eyes. Showing folks that legends don't have to fade away. Sometimes they just need to adapt, to wait for the right moment. The morning sun had climbed high over Rattlesnake Junction, casting sharp shadows across the bullet-scarred streets. But something else had changed in the town. Something more fundamental than just the end of a threat. The legend of Swift. Shot Sarah had transformed into something new, something that would be told around fires for generations to come. The weeks following the Battle of Rattlesnake Junction brought changes that few could have predicted. The story of how an elderly widow and her improvised army of townswomen had defeated Blackjack McCullough's gang spread across the territory, like wildfire growing with each telling. But for once, the truth was more remarkable than the embellishments. Sarah Hawkins's garden bloomed as always that autumn, desert roses adding splashes of color to the dusty landscape. She could often be found there in the early mornings, tending her flowers with the same precise care she gave to maintaining her guns. But now, more often than not, she had company. The trick, she explained to Rebecca Anderson one morning, demonstrating the proper stance, is to breathe with the shot, let it flow naturally like water running downhill. A row of tin cans stood on the fence, waiting. Want to show me what you've learned? Rebecca's shots rang out, quick and clean. 5 cans went, spinning into the dust. The schoolteacher smiled, lowering her rifle. Not quite as fast as you, Miss Sarah. Speed comes with time, Sarah replied, adjusting Rebecca's grip slightly. Accuracy matters more. Remember what I told you about James? That he could shoot. A playing card at 50 paces? That he never drew first, Sarah corrected, touching the silver brooch at her throat. Said the fastest shot isn't always the right one. Timing matters more than speed. In town, changes were more visible. The bank had a new female teller, armed with more than just a pleasant smile. Eleanor Turner had turned her bakery's back room into an informal shooting gallery where townswomen practiced daily. Even Mrs. Cooper, the sheriff's wife, now wore a small derringer openly on her belt while doing her shopping. Marcus Kane had stayed on, accepting Cooper's offer of a deputy's position. "Town's getting quite a reputation," he told Sarah over coffee. One evening, "Word is, outlaws are giving it a wide berth. Seems they don't cotton to the idea of being outshot by grandmothers." Sarah's laugh was warm as summer wind. "Let them talk. Fear's a powerful deterrent, and legends serve their purpose." The trial of Black Jack McCullough and his surviving men was swift and decisive. When Sarah testified, describing the events at Mesa Creek and James's murder, her quiet dignity carried more weight than any dramatic accusations could have. McCullough and his core gang were sentenced to hang, while the lesser members faced lengthy prison terms. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the town saw Sarah herself. The disguise of a simple widow had been permanently lifted, but instead of diminishing her, it had transformed her into something new. She was still the kind grandmother who baked pies for church socials and tended her garden. But now everyone understood these were choices made by a legend, not limitations imposed by age. Young Billy Murphy summed it up best one day, watching Sarah teach a group of women the finer points of rifle maintenance. "You know what's really amazing," he told his father. "Not that she can still shoot like that at her age, but that she spent 20 years letting people think she couldn't, just waiting for the right moment." On a crisp autumn evening, exactly 1 month after the battle, Sarah sat on her porch with Rebecca and Kane, watching the sunset paint the desert gold. Her mare's leg rested across her lap as she cleaned it, the familiar routine soothing as prayer. "Buffalo. Bill sent another letter," she mentioned casually. "Still wants me to join his Wild West show. Says a lady sharpshooter my age would be quite the draw." "Will you go?" Rebecca asked. Sarah smiled, her fingers tracing the silver brooch that James had given her so long ago. "My performing days are done, but teaching days—" She nodded toward the group of women practicing at Rebecca's makeshift range. "Those are just beginning." The legend of Swiftshot, Sarah had indeed transformed, becoming something more than just tales of a famous exhibition shooter. Now it was a story of patience, of wisdom, of knowing when to wait and when to act. But more than that, it was a reminder that age doesn't diminish legend. It distills it, like fine whiskey, into something even more potent. As darkness settled, over Rattlesnake Junction, lights twinkled in windows like earthbound stars. Each one represented a home, where new stories were being told, new lessons being learned. And in her rocking chair, Sarah Hawkins, no longer hiding her legend, but wearing it with quiet pride, kept watch over the town she had helped transform, proving that some legends don't fade, they just teach others how to become legendary themselves.